When Dan Wilkins said it, he couldn't even look me in the eye. "We're restructuring. Your position has been eliminated, effective immediately." Just like that. No warning, no discussion, nothing. I sat across from him at that long glass table in the freezing conference room. My hands were clenched under the table so he wouldn't see how hard they were shaking. He looked about 28, barely able to run a meeting without reading from his notepad. I had worked at Wilkins Innovations for 3 years. I built the software that now handled millions of dollars in transactions every single week. That platform didn't exist before I created it. And now I was the one being eliminated. My name is Sarah Lawson. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. After Dan spoke, the rest of his words barely registered. My ears were ringing. Outside, I looked calm, but inside, I was furious. The man had never pulled an all-nighter in his life. Meanwhile, I'd given up weekends, vacations, even my birthday last year to build that system from nothing. "Okay," I said after a moment, "then let's talk about severance and bonuses. I assume that's already in process." Dan finally looked up, confused, as if I'd asked what he wanted for lunch. Right. So, yeah, the new management is reviewing all legacy compensation structures. At this point, no additional severance or performance bonus is being approved." I blinked. "Excuse me?" He shrugged. "I don't have the authority to approve anything beyond base exit pay. HR can explain it." I kept my voice steady and leaned forward just slightly. "So, you're saying the performance bonuses we contractually agreed on? Those are just gone?" Dan put on this fake apologetic face and nodded like he was doing me a favor. "I get it's frustrating, Sarah, but things are changing. We're heading in a new direction." He was hiding behind buzzwords now. New direction, streamlining, all of it meaningless corporate nonsense. I sat there holding back every word I wanted to yell. I had kept this company running. Dan was just playing CEO's son with daddy's money, and I was being tossed aside like an outdated printer. "Fine," I said. "Then I'll speak to legal." He flinched just a little, then forced a smile. "Sure, HR can get you their info." I stood up. My chair scraped loudly across the floor. His fake smile vanished. I didn't slam the door, but I walked out fast enough that everyone in the hallway turned to look. Back at my desk, I packed up my 2 monitors, my laptop, and 3 years of work into a cardboard box. But inside, something had already shifted. I still had my contracts, my emails, and most importantly, the original code. Dan Wilkins had just made the biggest mistake of his life. I dropped the box on my kitchen table and opened my laptop before I even took off my jacket. My hands were still shaking. But now it was adrenaline, not shock. The first thing I pulled up was my original consulting agreement from when I first started with Wilkins Innovations. I scrolled past the usual non-compete clauses and compliance sections until I reached the part I wrote with my lawyer. It was right there, in plain text. All proprietary software developed by the consultant remains the intellectual property of the consultant unless otherwise licensed in writing. And I had never signed any licensing agreement. Not one. Not for the framework. Not for the transaction processor. Not for the internal tools they used every single day. I opened a folder on my desktop labeled Core Platform. Inside were subfolders for each component: backend services, data sync, API interface, all with timestamps, build versions, commit logs. I clicked through the files quickly, checking the dates. Everything up through the company's second funding round was still mine. Even after they hired me full-time, I never merged the code into their private repo. They used it based on a handshake agreement, but we never formalized anything. That meant they had been using my code, my system, for 2 years without paying the licensing fees we agreed to at the start. I opened my inbox and typed in searches: licensing, contract, language, approval, handoff, IP rights, email after email popped up. Messages from the CTO, from Dan, from project leads. Let's keep using Sarah's base code. The Lawson system still outperforms third-party solutions. No need to rebuild from scratch. This wasn't just sloppy. This was theft. I opened a new folder and started organizing everything. Contracts, email threads, internal architecture diagrams, even meeting notes I'd taken during weekend builds. I took screenshots, saved PDFs, and backed everything up to 2 different drives. This wasn't about revenge. I wasn't trying to burn the company down. But I wasn't going to let them steal from me and walk away like I didn't matter. The next morning, I called Jane Harris. She answered on the second ring. Jane Harris speaking. Hi, this is Sarah Lawson. My friend Alex Mark said you handle IP litigation for software developers. I do, she said, calm and direct. Tell me what's going on. I gave her the short version: contracted code, no license, company using it without paying, laid off with no severance. She paused. Do you have the original agreement? Already in a folder. I also have timestamps, source files, and emails showing they knew the code was mine. Then you might have a very strong case. We set up a secure file share, and I spent the rest of the day uploading everything. While the files transferred, I kept digging, reading recent cases and federal IP law until my eyes ached. I wasn't naive. Wilkins Innovations had the money and lawyers to drag this out for months or years. But they had underestimated me, just like every guy in tech who assumed I was the project manager instead of the one actually building things. Late that night, Jane called back. I've reviewed the contract. Your IP clause is solid. I also checked their filings. If they're using your code without a license, they're exposed. What's our next move? I asked. We build a timeline, gather everything, then we send a formal letter of demand. Good, I said. Let's get to work. By midnight, I was still at the kitchen table, eyes burning, typing out a detailed chronology of every deployment I'd completed. I didn't care about the exhaustion. I cared about the facts, the ownership, and making sure that some overpaid nepotism prince didn't walk off with what was mine. They thought I'd roll over, cry, disappear. But I wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, I sent Jane everything: my consulting agreement, code archives, email chains, all of it. Every file was labeled and time-stamped, clear and organized. She called within 2 hours. I've gone through the entire packet. This is airtight, Sarah. The contract is clear. Your documentation is meticulous. And the licensing gap is massive. You have leverage. I exhaled slowly. So what now? We send a demand letter. No threats, just facts. Breach of contract, unlicensed use, direct violation of intellectual property law. Good, I said. I want it sent today. Jane didn't hesitate. That afternoon, she sent me the draft. Everything laid out plainly: the IP clause, the lack of licensing documents, the usage timeline, the revenue generated from my platform. Then came the demand. Back payment for 2 years of licensing plus future fees if they wanted to continue using the code. It was bold and direct. I approved it immediately. 3 days later, I got the call. Hi, Ms. Lawson. This is Danielle from HR at Wilkins Innovations. We've received the legal notice regarding your claim. Our legal department is reviewing it. Her voice sounded scripted, robotic. Great, I said. Tell Dan I'm looking forward to his response. She paused, then hung up. I stared at my phone for a moment, then went back to my laptop. It was out of my hands for now. And the waiting. That part drove me crazy. Days went by with no update, no email, nothing. To stay afloat, I took freelance work, back-end repairs, cleanup jobs, short-term builds. Not glamorous, but it kept the bills paid. Rent doesn't wait for justice. Neither did my car payment. At night, Jane and I stayed on the phone, tightening every part of the case. We went through every inch of my files. I wrote detailed technical summaries to make the licensing terms absolutely foolproof. Jane had handled plenty of startups like this before. She knew exactly how companies like them operated: delay, distract, deny. But I wasn't giving them a single chance to wiggle out. Then, 1 week later, it arrived. Jane forwarded me an email from the General Counsel at Wilkins Innovations. "Dear Miss Lawson, we respectfully reject the claims outlined in your letter of demand. Upon review, we conclude that all work conducted after your full-time employment began constitutes work for hire under federal copyright law and therefore is the property of Wilkins Innovations, Inc. No licensing agreement is necessary, nor was one ever implied. Respectfully, Martin Heller, General Counsel, Wilkins Innovations." I stared at the screen. My ears went hot, and my chest felt like it was buzzing. "Work for hire? Are you kidding me?" I called Jane immediately. "They're trying to gaslight the entire agreement," I said, pacing the length of my kitchen. "They're pretending the consulting phase never existed." "They know exactly what they're doing," she replied. "They think you'll back off or settle for pennies." My jaw tightened. "They want me to disappear." "They want to outlast you," she said. "This is standard corporate strategy. Bury the smaller party in paperwork and legal bills until they can't afford to keep fighting." I pressed my fist against the counter until my arm trembled. "Well, I'm not going anywhere." "I didn't think you were," she said. "But now it's officially serious. They're not bluffing. You need to be ready for a fight." I sat back at my kitchen table and opened my folders again. Fine. They wanted a war? They were going to get one. I pulled up every version of my code that existed before my full-time employment start date, labeled, signed, documented, every line I wrote before I ever stepped into their office as an employee. They could twist legal definitions all they wanted, but I wrote the system. I owned it, and I was going to prove it. I stayed up until 3 a.m. finishing the last piece of documentation Jane needed. My eyes were burning, my wrists ached from typing, but quitting wasn't even an option. By sunrise, she filed the lawsuit. Wilkins Innovations was officially facing claims for breach of contract and intellectual property theft. From that moment forward, everything shifted. I wasn't just someone they could ignore anymore. I was a legal threat. The next few weeks were brutal. My inbox turned into a battlefield: court notices, procedural filings, endless exchanges between Jane and their lawyers. I watched the hours disappear while my bank account drained. Retainers, filing fees, administrative costs. Every one of them hit like a punch. Every call with Jane cost money. Every counter motion they filed meant more research, more documentation, more time I didn't have. Freelance work slowed down. I couldn't focus. Some days I could barely look at my laptop without wanting to throw it out the window. And sleep? That became a joke. I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, repeating legal terms I barely understood, wondering how long I could keep this up. The pressure never stopped. I started grinding my teeth in my sleep, lost weight without trying. My phone buzzed constantly: Jane, clerks, clients, debt collectors. Most days I kept my apartment dark just to keep headaches under control. But I kept going. Every extra moment I had went into digging through old backups, pulling metadata from original files, tracing timestamps, building a full timeline. I printed out emails and highlighted everything even remotely useful. My living room wall turned into a giant evidence map: lines, notes, arrows, like I was tracking a criminal. Jane had warned me early on. "They're going to try to wear you down. They'll question everything. Your contract, your timeline, your intentions. They'll use every delay to pile on costs and stall the process. That's their entire strategy." "And ours?" I asked. "Outwork them, outdocument them, corner them." The next move from Wilkins was exactly what we expected. Their attorneys filed a motion claiming my original consulting agreement was overridden by my full-time employment offer. They argued that once I joined payroll, everything I produced automatically belonged to the company under the work-for-hire doctrine. I sat on my couch reading the motion, fists clenched so tightly I thought a bone might crack. Then I called Jane. They're trying to rewrite history. They'll do worse before this is over. At this point, I wasn't just fighting for compensation. I was fighting for my name, for the fact that I built something from nothing, and they were trying to erase me from the story entirely. Pretend I was just another developer in the background, someone with a desk and a salary, but no real ownership. They didn't understand. I was the system. I built it alone in my apartment on cheap coffee and almost no sleep. I wrote every line, tested every module, scaled every update. And now some kid with a title and a trust fund wanted to stamp his name on it. Absolutely not. I spent an entire weekend digging through Slack archives, Google Drive logs, Git history, anything proving the boundary between my consulting work and what came afterward. I found old messages from Dan himself saying things like, "Let's not mess with Sarah's core engine," and "We're lucky she let us keep using it." Every piece of it went into the case file. They wanted to drain my bank account, but they didn't realize how stubborn I could be. I had already spent years in rooms where men talked over me, managers took credit for my work, and clients asked if there was a man they could speak to. They picked the wrong woman to try to erase. This was just another version of the same fight I'd been dealing with for years. Only now it came wrapped in legal paperwork and invoices. And I wasn't backing down. I was deep in documentation when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my gut told me to answer. Hello? Hey, it's Kevin. I straightened up instantly. Kevin? From Wilkins? Yeah. Sorry for calling out of nowhere. Look, I don't want this traced back to me, but you should know what's happening here. I closed my laptop. Go ahead. He exhaled slowly. Dan's been walking around saying you're trying to blackmail the company. He's telling HR the lawsuit is a sham and you're just a bitter ex-employee looking for a payout. My stomach flipped, but I forced my voice to stay calm. He's really calling it extortion? Yeah, that exact word. I didn't speak for a moment. Kevin filled the silence. But everyone on the dev team knows the truth, Sarah. We were there. We saw what you built. The whole system still runs on your original code. No one doubts that. People are just scared. Dan's acting paranoid. He's pulling up old code reviews, asking managers to rewrite past notes just in case this goes to court. He's covering himself. And I hate to say this, but be careful. He's trying to paint you as unstable and vindictive. I stared at the wall, jaw locked. Thanks for telling me. Of course. I just don't want you blindsided. I hung up and sat there in silence, my phone still in my hand. That was Dan's new tactic. Ruin my reputation before a judge even saw the case. If enough people believed his version early on, then even a legal win would still leave me looking like the problem. I texted Jane, then opened my laptop again. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Later that week, Dan called me himself. His name lit up my screen. I almost ignored it, but I wanted to hear whatever angle he was going to try next. Hey, Sarah, he said, like we were old friends catching up. Thought it was time we talked directly. I mean, come on. Lawyers? Really? You fired me and stole my work, Dan. What did you expect? A fruit basket? He gave a little laugh. Look, I get you're upset, but there's a way to end this without hurting either of us long term. I've got some room to negotiate, if you're reasonable. Define reasonable. I've been authorized to offer a settlement. Nothing massive, but enough to cover your time. We draft an NDA, end the whole thing clean. No damage to your reputation, no more court fees. We both walk away. You want to pay me to disappear. I want to make it right, he said, lowering his voice. We both know this lawsuit won't go anywhere. We can skip the noise, the expenses. Sarah, you're too smart for this. That line hit a nerve. I gripped the phone harder. You think I'm stupid enough to settle just because you tell me I'm too smart to keep fighting? Try again. He sighed. All right. Up to you. Then he hung up. I sat back down and opened the project files again. The core data manager, the original routing logic, the draft patent submission I never filed, but still had saved. If this went to court, I'd need to prove exactly where their system ended and mine began. Every night that week, I studied line-level commits, API changes, every piece of the timeline. Jane and I scheduled late-night calls to practice testimony and go over case law. At this point, it wasn't just about being right. It was about making sure they couldn't rewrite my story. I was knee-deep in code comparisons when Kevin messaged again. Shit's hitting the fan here. They're auditing the entire repo. Tyler's freaking out. I sat up, cracked my knuckles, and called him instantly. He answered in a whisper, like he was hiding in a supply closet. They're doing a full code audit. Dan hired some outside consultant to review every file you ever touched, trying to figure out what's yours and what's theirs. What does that tell you? I asked. They're scared, Sarah. They know they're exposed. The dev team's been pulled into meetings all week. Everyone's tense. I looked over at the timeline spread across my wall. They waited too long to panic, I muttered. Kevin hesitated. They also want us to flag any files where your name is still in the metadata. Dan asked if we could scrub the author tags from the core modules. Let me guess. Tyler said yes. Of course he did. Let them, I said. I have clean backups of everything. You think they're getting ready to settle? I didn't answer. That night, I jumped on a call with Jane and told her everything. They're reviewing the repo? She asked, already typing. That's big. They're worried about liability. It means they know your codebase is still running in production. Yeah. Kevin said they're scrambling to cover their tracks, probably trying to avoid depositions. This could be a turning point, she said. If they're panicking enough to audit now, they might realize settling is safer than losing in court. I muted the call and leaned back in my chair. If this were just about money, that would have been enough. I could take the settlement, pay off my credit cards, and stop living on fumes. But it wasn't about money anymore. I kept thinking about the way Dan dismissed me, the way Tyler acted like my work automatically became theirs the moment I walked through their doors. Like I didn't build the entire system from the ground up before they even handed me my first paycheck. Any word from their legal team? I asked when I unmuted. Nothing yet, Jane said. Just keep the pressure on. Don't blink. I didn't sleep at all that night. My mind wouldn't stop. Settling meant financial relief, a chance to breathe again. But settling without accountability, without recognition, without truth, that would haunt me forever. They'd win the story, and I'd become just another woman pushed out of her own creation. The next day, Kevin called again. No greeting, just panic in his voice. They're screwed, he said. Completely screwed. I straightened in my chair. What happened? The consultant they brought in told Tyler that rebuilding the system without your framework would take over a year. Minimum. That got my full attention. A year? Yeah, and that's assuming the dev team doesn't quit first. Morale's in the gutter. People are exhausted. And the worst part? Your name is everywhere in the code. Architecture docs, module headers, comment logs. There's no way to erase you without leaving a forensic trail. I exhaled slowly, anger and satisfaction mixing in my chest. Kevin continued. And now Tyler's telling people you stole proprietary code, that the company owned everything from day one and you're trying to cash in. My jaw locked. So I'm the thief now? Not everyone's buying it, he said quickly. Half the team remembers exactly what happened. You built it. Tyler barely touched the core stack for months. People know. I shook my head, staring down at my hands. They're rewriting the story because they're cornered. They're desperate, Kevin said. Don't back off now. I didn't plan to. Not anymore. I hung up and immediately pulled out my project binders. Every module Tyler was suddenly claiming as his, I traced each one back to original commits. I wasn't defending myself. I was building the case that would bury them. 2 days later, an email from Jane hit my inbox. Offer received, urgent. Wilkins Innovations had offered a settlement. $50,000 in exchange for a full NDA, no future claims, no public record, no acknowledgement. I stared at the number, a hollow laugh slipping out. $50,000 for a system powering half of their revenue, for code they were still using, for the work they'd stolen. I dialed Jane. You saw it, she said gently. Yeah, and it's insulting. I know, she admitted, but objectively, it's not terrible. 6 months of litigation and expenses are stacking up. Jane, this isn't about margins, I snapped. They want to buy my silence. They want me to disappear. She paused. And if you don't settle, this could go on another year. Depositions, discovery, testimony. They'll attack your timeline and credibility. I need you to understand what you're choosing. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling. 50,000 would help. Sure. But it would feel like blood money, like selling my name for a discount. They wanted to erase the woman whose work they were still running in production. The next morning, I called her back. I'm rejecting it. Are you sure? She asked. Absolutely, we're close. They wouldn't offer an NDA if they weren't scared. You realize this means war. I know, I said. I'm ready. For the next week, my apartment became a battlefield. Stacks of printed comets, color-coded timelines, metadata reports cross-checked against backups, witness lists, old co-workers offering statements. Kevin, ready to testify if needed. I barely slept. I barely ate. But the fire in my chest kept me moving. This wasn't revenge. This was survival. This was my name, my code, my legacy. Then, on a quiet Wednesday, Jane called. Her voice was sharp, but calm. They folded. I froze. What? They're offering full compensation, back pay, missed bonuses, 2 years of unpaid licensing, every penny, and a formal future use agreement. My breath caught. Wait. Licensing? They agreed? They're proposing a 5-year exclusive license, she said. You keep full IP rights. They pay for use. You control renewals. And Sarah, there's no NDA, no gag order, full credit in writing. I closed my eyes. For the first time in months, the floor stopped shaking beneath me. What changed? I whispered. Jane exhaled. The internal audit terrified them. Jane's voice softened. I also think their outside counsel finally told them the truth. Either you were going to win outright, or worse for them, they were going to spend another year paying to lose slowly. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the wall of documents, flowcharts, and call notes. All the evidence I'd lived inside for months was still there, but for the first time, it didn't feel like pressure. It just felt finished. Jane added, Their CEO is calling you directly. He asked to speak with you before we sign. I hesitated. Dan's father? Yeah, Michael Wilkins. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Hello? Ms. Lawson? A calm, older voice said, This is Michael Wilkins. Thank you for taking my call. His tone wasn't corporate polished. It was tired, like a man trying to fix something too late. I've reviewed everything personally, he said, and I owe you an apology. You were right. We mishandled the agreement, and my son made a number of poor decisions. I didn't respond. I've seen the code. I've seen the reports. What you built. It's the spine of our company. You deserve recognition, and you will have it. I swallowed. Then why let it get this far? I trusted the wrong people, including Dan. That's on me. For a moment, I wanted to tear into him, but I didn't need to. I had already won. The licensing agreement has been approved, he continued. From now on, any use of your work will be documented, paid, and under your terms. And Dan? I asked. A pause. He's no longer involved in legal or operational decisions. He's been redirected. I almost laughed. Thank you for holding us accountable, he said quietly. Then the call ended. I sat there staring at my laptop, letting the silence settle. The fight was over. Not because they were kind, but because I refused to fold. Jane sent the final agreement that night, clean, precise. Everything we demanded, in writing. Retroactive licensing, paid. Performance bonuses, paid. Full credit attached to the IP. Ownership rights, undisputed. It wasn't just a win, it was validation. The truth, finally, on paper. I signed at the bottom of the last page and closed my laptop gently, like setting down a weight I'd carried for too long. 2 days later, the money hit my account. Every cent, every fee, every bonus. Hard proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. Hard proof that I was right to fight. The first thing I did was pay off every legal bill. Then my credit cards. Then I canceled the freelance gig I'd been clinging to just to make rent. For the first time in years, I wasn't one late payment away from drowning. But the best part wasn't the money. It was knowing I'd walked through fire and refused to burn. 2 weeks later, I joined a small startup in Charlotte, a 6-person team, hungry and brilliant. The founder brought me on as lead architect. He handed me the stack and said, "You tell us what you need, and we'll stay out of your way." I actually laughed during the interview, not out of sarcasm, but relief. And they meant it. They documented everything. My name was on every module I touched. No politics, no erasure, just work, and credit where it belonged. 3 months in, I'd rebuilt their entire infrastructure from scratch. We deployed our first client platform last week, and this time, every licensing detail was spelled out from day one. No handshakes, no assumptions, no loopholes. I'd learned my lesson. Now, when I look at the work I do, I don't just see the code. I see ownership, leverage, protection. I see the woman who kept walking when no one believed her, until they finally had no choice but to see the truth. It wasn't easy. None of it was. But I'll say this. No one will ever erase my name from my work again. Not ever.